Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for this roundtable discussion. When the brutal terrorist attack happened on the east side here in Buffalo on May 14th, I insisted that our union's response to that horror could not be a one-off reaction or event, but instead we must stop, listen, and work toward the necessary structural change. We must be committed to the long-run healing of the East Side community in Buffalo, healing that has been needed for decades, well before May 14th. We began this work through conversations with members of the Buffalo community. We reached out to learn more about the issues and the history of the East Side and to amplify the voices of those who have been committed in word and deed to liberating their community and its members from the generations of racist violence that are so endemic in our society. I mostly listened and learned as several of these community members participated in one of the first episodes of our UUP podcast. From these conversations, I knew that the role UUP must take is to be present and take actions that will address the longstanding issues that the Black community faces. At the same time, UUP also began to learn through our work with the Kennedy Forum about the impact that both direct and indirect racism has on the mental and emotional well-being of individuals and entire communities. Communities that experience trauma are left to carry the weight of the initial trauma along with long-term intergenerational trauma, as the equitable and accessible resources to support the impact of racism on mental health are inadequate. From that, we began to plan this panel discussion. Today, we have brought together experts to discuss the negative effect that direct and indirect racism has on mental health care, the central issues of access to care, the inequitable treatment within the healthcare system for people who have access, and the ongoing biases that are perpetuated within mental health models. UUP is engaged in this conversation with the intent of making mental health equity a major priority for our union, for SUNY, and the state of New York. As I have stated many times, though our union has constantly stood for the causes of social justice, what we need is for SUNY to be at the cutting edge of creating the changes necessary to bring about a more just New York. SUNY is uniquely positioned to do so. All that is lacking is the will. I am so honored to be monitoring this conversation today. The work of liberation and justice awaits. Let us begin. As we gather to discuss the mental health crisis gripping our communities, it is important that we begin the day and be welcomed by someone who can speak directly to the importance of this collective work. As Mayor of Buffalo, Byron Brown sees how the failures of mental health care play out in our public schools, on our streets, in crimes we can prevent, and in higher education where we can foster a better future. Mayor Brown is a graduate of Buffalo State. Like so many SUNY graduates, he wasn't born and raised here, but this is where he set down roots and charted the path of his career. After graduating from high school in Queens, he made his way to Buffalo, earned a degree in political science and journalism. He would work behind the scenes in local and state government here in Erie County until he was elected to serve on the Buffalo Common Council beginning in 1996. In 2000, he successfully ran for the state Senate, becoming New York State's first African-American state senator elected outside of New York City. 5 years later, Mayor Brown was elected Buffalo's 62nd mayor, taking office in January of 2006. Since that time, he has worked tirelessly for the neighborhoods across the city of Buffalo. He has been a friend to the thousands of UUP members who call Buffalo home, and he has been an advocate for SUNY campuses. He has also been an example of public service to the tens of thousands of young men and women who attend UB, Buffalo State, Fredonia, and other SUNY institutions in Western New York. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome Mayor Byron Brown.
Our community has had much to grapple with this past year, events that can impact our mental health. As you know, on May 14th of this year, the Buffalo community experienced one of the most painful events in its history when a racist, hate-filled individual invaded our city and took the lives of 10 innocent community members and wounded 3 others. A person whose expressed intent was to kill as many black people as possible changed our lives forever. Our community was deeply affected by this event. This horrific tragedy highlighted many issues that have impacted our community and black and brown communities nationwide. Across our country, we have seen over a century of underfunding by the federal government in black and brown neighborhoods. This has led to unacceptable increases in gun violence, segregation, crime, poor health outcomes, and generational poverty. These factors made Buffalo a target for the May 14th shooter. This act of domestic terrorism, fueled by racism and white supremacy, had a significant mental health and economic impact on our city. Within the first 2 weeks of the shooting, city departments spent over $500,000 of unbudgeted dollars on police, fire, and sanitation overtime and other related expenses. We continue to deal with what we know will be a long-lasting and negative impact on the psychological well-being of survivors as well as children in our city. And Fred mentioned the trauma that many in the black community are dealing with and have been dealing with for a very long period of time. Well, this shooting created trauma on top of trauma. And while, yes, the impacts were particularly deep on the black community and black children, we found in Buffalo that children of all backgrounds were frightened, impacted, and traumatized by this horrific shooting. We found children in every section of the city and parts of the suburbs that were afraid to go to school because of this racist attack, afraid to go out of their homes. So yes, the impact is deep on the black community, but the impact of racism is painful and deep for all of us. Since May 14th, I've been helping to give voice to all those impacted by this senseless shooting, the victims, the survivors, and the community who are coping with the aftermath by participating in a variety of discussions at the local, state, and national level. These discussions have focused on public safety, sensible gun reform, social media, education, and yes, mental health. My administration has focused on how to address the impact of mental health issues in our community. One way we have done this is by creating an innovative partnership with Endeavor Health Services to embed psychologists with Buffalo police officers in the field, as well as at Buffalo Police Headquarters, called the Behavioral Health Team. This special team of officers underwent extensive training in mental health, which enabled them to work with the Endeavor clinicians and ensure the city can respond more effectively to calls involving individuals who, because of any kind of mental health crisis or distress, might pose a danger to themselves and others. The team has been a tremendous success. In 2022 alone, there have been over 1,000 calls for service without incident. When communities like Buffalo are impacted by acts of racism, like we were in May, there is a mental and emotional toll. Through this panel discussion, I am hopeful you will address the visceral potency of racism and the harmful effects that it has on mental health. As we learn from the past and strive for a more equitable future, we must never forget this tragic event.
Thank you, Mayor Brown. Without further delay, I am honored to introduce our expert panelists and begin this roundtable discussion. Let me begin with Dr. Norma L. Day Vines. Dr. Day Vines serves as Associate Dean for Diversity and Faculty Development in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University and maintains a faculty appointment as Professor of Counseling and Educational Studies. She is the clinical research lead at Hurdle Health, the leading provider of culturally intentional digital mental health services. The telehealth company trains its therapists using a cultural competence curriculum developed by Dr. Day Vines. Dr. Day Vines' research agenda examines the importance of multiculturalism as an indispensable tool in the delivery of culturally competent counseling and educational services for clients and students from marginalized groups. Her scholarship has appeared in leading counseling journals such as the Journal of Counseling and Development, the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development, and Professional School Counseling. Dr. Day Vines has consulted with school districts across the country to address issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In 2019, she was awarded a presidential citation from the American Counseling Association in recognition for her scholarship on multiculturalism. Welcome, Dr. Day Vines. Next, we have Dr. Pierluigi Mancini. Dr. Mancini has over 30 years of experience providing culturally and linguistically appropriate behavioral health treatment and prevention. In 1999, he founded Georgia's only Latino behavioral health agency designed to serve the immigrant population, delivering affordable and appropriate mental health, addiction treatment, and prevention services in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Dr. Mancini is a nationally and internationally renowned consultant advising at all levels of government. He recently led a project to train clinicians in Latin America who are taking care of over 4 million displaced Venezuelans in the region. Dr. Mancini serves as the chair-elect on the board of directors for Mental Health America National, an organization committed to anti-racism and the promotion of mental health as a critical part of overall wellness. Dr. Mancini also serves on the boards of the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse and Recovery Innovations International. Welcome, Dr. Mancini. Our next panelist, I am proud to say, is a fellow UUP member, Dr. Peter Martin. Dr. Martin is currently an assistant professor of psychiatry for the University at Buffalo. He is board certified in general child and adolescent and forensic psychiatry. He is the director for the Division of Community Psychiatry. He works in a variety of settings dealing with the intersection of psychiatry and the law. He provides treatment and conducts court-ordered evaluations in both the adult and youth correctional systems. Dr. Martin also participates in community-based organizations focusing on youth that have complex systems of care needs. Dr. Martin participates in the supervision and teaching of medical students, residents, and fellows, and is the director for the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship Program. Dr. Martin completed his undergraduate education at UB, where he completed his general psychiatry residency while simultaneously participating in the American Psychiatric Association's Public Psychiatry Fellowship. Welcome, Dr. Martin. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to Kowal. Kowal has worked in the field of mental health for 21 years and is a New York State credentialed alcoholism and substance abuse counselor. He is the director of youth programs for the Mental Health Advocates of Western New York and the president and founder of his own consulting company. Mr. Shallohorn draws on his personal experience to help others. He was a featured speaker for a TEDx Buffalo 2021, where he gave the talk, African American Men and Mental Health, Crisis or Opportunity, and was featured in the 2021 A&E Network documentary Voices Magnified Mental Health Crisis. Mr. Shallowhorn has received numerous awards for his mental health advocacy work, including from the National Federation for Just Communities and the Buffalo Association of Black Social Workers. He is the host of Mental Health Versus, which can be heard on 91.3 FM, WBNY Buffalo. Mr. Shallowhorn is a proud SUNY graduate, having earned his master's degree in Student Personnel Administration from Buffalo State. Welcome, Mr. Shallowhorn. The way the program will proceed is I will be posing a series of pre-selected questions to get the conversation started and allow our panelists to expound on their ideas, experiences, and research. My goal will be to open the floor at the end of the panelist discussion for questions or additional thoughts from all of you who have joined us today for this important conversation, as time allows. I do have to add that caveat. To begin, we are addressing some big and sometimes unwieldy topics today. Can our panelists begin by putting some working definitions or explanations on the table for the following, each of the following: structural racism, generational trauma, mental health equity, culturally competent and responsive mental health care delivery?
When we think about cultural competence, it presumes that there's a finite body of information. It just presumes that there's an endpoint. It presumes that, once you got it, you got it. But, we know that culture is not static and it's ongoing. So many counselors and psychologists are moving towards this notion of multicultural orientation. And when we think about multicultural orientation, we're thinking more about how the counselor shows up, sort of your essence. Your sense of cultural humility, the notion that you have a sense of curiosity about your client, the notion that you acknowledge the limitations. So a lot of times we come into counseling and we act like we are the end-all be-all, but a client sitting across from us knows that we probably don't know anything about their culture, and so we have to acknowledge that. Another part of a multicultural orientation is cultural opportunities. How do we seize opportunities to talk about the embeddedness of issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture in the client's presenting concerns? I've been teaching for 25 years at 3 different universities, and one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of times counselors will pivot away from issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture rather than lean into them. But people's problems are often inextricably bound to issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture. So how do we teach students to have these discussions? And then finally, cultural comfort. There's a body of research that talks about counselors sometimes and psychologists sometimes being ill at ease with clients. But part of working with minoritized clients is making them feel comfortable, making them feel a sense of belonging, not acting afraid.
And when we talk about culture, I want to add language. So instead of cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, for us to talk about cultural and linguistic, including the deaf community. Deaf and hard of hearing resources are scarce, and we're also not taking care of them. So my specialty is on immigrant and refugee communities and the linguistic barriers that exist in having bilingual clinicians or having organizations that can actually serve them or welcome them in a culturally appropriate way. It's difficult. But the one I wanted to focus on was the structural and institutional racism, because these are, to me, one of the biggest barriers and probably the easiest to fix. Because when we talk about that kind of racism, are pervasively and deeply embedded policies and procedures in systems and in organizations. And there's 2 ways that they're there. They were placed there on purpose, or they were placed there a long time ago and nobody's looked at them to revise them. But at the end of the day, we behave as an organization, as a system based on policy and procedures. I applaud what the mayor said, that the police officers are getting extensive mental health training, but sending the police still criminalizes an illness, right? So we launched 988 in July, and there's still hundreds of thousands of people that don't know what 988 is, right? And it is the alternative. You call 988 for a mental health crisis or a suicide attempt or thought, and clinicians talk to you. If somebody needs to be dispatched, a clinician gets dispatched, right? So those barriers, structural and institutional, are the ones that need to be changed at the local, state, federal, and organizational level. Because that's where we're responding as to who we let into our organization, who we're able to serve, what kind of insurance or cash payment they have. And if they don't fit any of those, then they're out. And most of the time, who's out is black and brown, right? So we have to be able to take those head on, and we have to be able to start changing those structural barriers that exist in our organizations.
As I think about kind of where to springboard off of these concerns too, one of the things we wanted to also talk about in terms of thinking of definitions, how to talk about is generational trauma. And as a clinician, I think about trauma all the time. You know, there's this concept of trauma-informed care. The concept that if you don't think about trauma, you'll probably miss it if you're seeing someone. Sometimes people will bring it up and it's right in front of you. But a lot of times it's more subtle, or maybe there's you can think of it as the tip of the iceberg. There's the stuff that's right in front of you, and then you have the huge base of other types of traumas. And that definitely takes place as we're thinking about these greater structural and institutional type of concerns that lead to ongoing traumatic events. I think about it a lot when I'm working with folks, especially that happen to have some touching within the correctional system, and maybe even more so when working with kids in the juvenile justice system, where we're just talking about like a criminalization of a behavior. Yes, maybe they are doing things that are quote bad, but there's a lot of things that lead up to that. And if I think about, and if I'm training different folks, one of the things I will consistently say, and I probably seem like a broken record, is you have to think, what's the consistent theme of everyone in this place is trauma, by and large. Maybe it's not what we call like a big T trauma, where like maybe your life was threatened, that type of idea. But maybe there's multiple little T traumas over and over. You're in an impoverished neighborhood where you don't even necessarily have the funding for food, so you have to balance, do I eat well or do I keep the lights on, that type of idea, and how that goes on and on and on. There are these things that are considered adverse childhood events. And these are thought about a lot, especially in general primary care, working with kids, working with adults. And one of the consistent themes is that the more of these adverse childhood events, or they're called ACEs, the more that people have these, it's a cumulative effect. And the more you have, the more you're at risk to have both mental and physical health issues, both as a youth and as an adult. And some of these things seem to be very obvious. Did you have a history of something like physical abuse, sexual abuse? So clearly a concern. Clearly, as we're talking about, some of these general factors will play into things. But then there's also these more subtle things. Have you ever had a family member that was incarcerated? So this is something where I'm talking with someone, and this is where I'll talk about the elephant in the room. They will look at me and I'll say, I'm clearly maybe not the same background as you. That doesn't mean I can't at least understand some of the impact of things. And so, for instance, I haven't had anyone in my family that was incarcerated or whatever. How about you? And by and large, almost everyone's like, yeah, actually, not only it's so common, it's almost hard to get past sometimes. It's a normative thing. And what types of things got to that, got it so that the person was there in the first place. So you look at these other types of events that maybe aren't necessarily what everyone else would say trauma, and yet it is an impact.
So when I consider mental health equity, I think of the broader idea of health equity and how it affects communities of color. So, for instance, many times, and I know even myself included, I may even take it for granted what I have available in terms of access to health care. I have health insurance. I have a provider. I have supports to help me get what I need when I need it. There are many people in our communities that don't have the same kind of access, for a lot of reasons. I think about medication. I take medication. I'm a person with lived experience with a mental condition. I take medication. But I have the things in place to be healthy. So we think about the inequity that exists in our communities. There are many disparities that people experience. So for instance, think about yourself. If you have to, say, make an appointment with a doctor, you probably already have a provider. You may have someone to go to address a condition you have. There are individuals in our communities that don't have something like this, or even if they do, they may be unable to afford to go. That's something that often isn't thought of. Even if there's insurance involved, there's co-pays. There's barriers in place that create inequities for people that get the help they need. And also, along with that, consider the fact that there are also other structures around equity that basically are barriers to care. So when you consider mental health itself, there's the idea of providers. So in other words, providers of color. I think it's something like 4%, not just off the top of my head thinking, 4% of social workers in our country are people of color. Psychologists. Like, in other words, there's such a huge disparity in the numbers of people of color that offer services that relates to the idea of cultural humility and understanding and competence, that for a person of color to go in and to see someone and to talk to someone that isn't like them, there's inequity. So how will I, as a person of color, go and speak to someone who I look at and I say, well, can you even relate to my experience? That's inequity. So there are a lot of things around this topic that often we don't even think of. And we were talking beforehand, before we began, and another way to look at it is just simply empathy. It's like a theme that for many people, they don't have this understanding or willingness to understand where the other person's coming from. If people were able to be more empathetic in their approach to just looking at the other person that's in front of them, I think a lot of these issues would be approached differently. So, from my perspective, both in my work, as a clinician, as a mental health advocate, as an educator, I always go back to empathy. That's one of the things we learn in our training, how to use empathy as a means of breaking down a lot of these barriers that keep us separated. So I think if we just simply did that, we'd be in a lot better shape.
May 14th, 158 days ago, white supremacists targeted the East Side Buffalo community in an act of domestic terrorism. And it was white supremacy in action. The impact that it had, as the mayor mentioned, was not just in the East Side community. It was not just in Buffalo. It was not just in the state of New York. It was national and indeed international. The question that I have, it is brief, but I believe it opens to the heart of the issue that we are examining. I invite all of the panelists to please speak to the short and long-term impacts of white supremacist violence. Violence, you can define it as you wish. From my definition, it is not just an act of physical aggression against another person. Okay. Violence on the mental health of individuals and communities who witness and experienced racialized violence near and or far.
I guess when I think about violence, and I think importantly, it's not only that it could happen or that it is happening, but the threat that it could happen too. And just the idea of, if I leave my house, am I going to have something bad happen to me? Or if I am just walking down the street and something seems to be suspicious and someone is going to maybe look at me differently just based on my background, et cetera, versus me doing something different. How can that not impact someone on a day-to-day basis? And that's one of these things where when I think about it also, and again, I keep coming back to things clinically because that's what I do. But I think about it on a day-to-day basis and how the lived-in experience of folks is just sometimes so much drastically different than what I go through. One time I had a kid who lived relatively nearby from where I am, but his life we might as well have lived on Mars. And it was so different. And just, he said, you don't understand, you don't get it. When I walk out of the house, I have to worry about violence. I have to worry about things. And I say, I understand that, but. And he said, no, there's no buts about this. Like, it's just, you just don't get it. And it was just one of these great eye-opening moments of like, you're right, I don't get it. And we're just talking about having empathy, right? Empathy being the idea of trying to see the experience from the other person, not necessarily sympathy, which you feel maybe even feel bad, etc. And both are important in their own way. But it was one of these great eye-opening experiences of realizing like there's a lot of different, either again that they are exposed to the direct risk of violence, or there's the concern. It's sort of like the elephant in the room at all times, and how does that impact their behaviors? And again, a lot of times it's more than I even appreciate, so I try to think about it actively.
Anti-immigrant sentiment is one of the biggest issues that I face every day. In the Latino community, there is effects, traumatic effects due to exclusionary immigration policies. There's also generational trauma caused by that. Now, anyone that's had to leave their country for whatever reason and immigrate to another country, everybody comes different ways. And in many of those, there is trauma associated with it, before, during, and after. That often goes undetected or untreated, because we don't have the ability to do it. We don't have the infrastructure to do it yet. But studies are beginning to come out where anti-immigrant sentiments affecting children is really creating a lot of problems. So the multilingual clinic that was mentioned during my introduction, we had a prevention program for elementary school kids. And we had everybody, American kids and Latino kids. And we would provide alternatives, right? Because kids get bored, right? So we had soccer, we had dance. And in the dance program, there was a group of girls, and they were really good dancers, middle school. So they would be invited to big events to go and dance for an event, or their state event. And one of those trips, we had a white van, and the girls were in the van, and we're going to a United Way building that had a nice space for events, and they were invited to dance there. And as we're pulling into the United Way building, there is a security guard in uniform, blue blazer, gray pants, and he's guiding the van to go into the garage. And one of the girls starts screaming, saying, "Immigration!" and throws herself on the floor of the van. And what's significant about this, she was a US-born third-generation Latina girl. And she had that reaction because of what goes on out there. So even though they may not be immigrant themselves, immigrant children or children born here to immigrant parents are facing some of these issues. Now, the political rhetoric also causes problems. A couple of years ago, the previous administration, it was no policy. It was just rumors that if you're an immigrant and you use social services, even if you're eligible, but if you use them, you're going to lose your residency. You're going to lose your citizenship. So what happened? Many immigrant families stopped taking their kids to the doctors. They stopped going for their care for whatever chronic condition they had. So, and the last thing I'll say about this, immigrants come all the time, and there is a process for citizenship. You go through residency, you go through citizenship. Well, the citizenship exam or the interview has a question about moral turpitude, and excess drinking is considered moral turpitude. So if you're a person in recovery from a substance use disorder, from an alcohol use disorder, and you're asked in the citizenship questionnaire if you've abused alcohol, you may not get to become a citizen, even if you're in recovery. So we have, going back to the structural institutional policies that we need to review to make sure that we're not hurting people, it becomes one of the most critical items.
So one thing that happens very much to communities of color is media. We have media in the room. We had a lot of media earlier. And when these stories are on, they just continue to keep these images ingrained in a person's mind, and it's sort of like you can't escape from it. Mind you, you can try to turn it off, but it's sort of like you can't escape it. I want to just get a show of hands. How many people here have social media? Okay, we got a pretty good number of people. So even through our social media, many times it's hard to get away from, unless you have a very narrow, group of friends, or if you have 5 friends. Well, I'm not being a little facetious, but it's true. It's hard to get away from all these things around us, because you may not have these issues, but you might have a friend who either I don't say friend, of course, Facebook friend, but you might have someone that says something, but it might be triggering. But think about it, once again, put yourself in the shoes of someone who is seeing these things, who has experienced these things either directly or is of the same ethnicity. Think about the many instances we've had over the years. When we see someone like George Floyd. Think about George Floyd. How many times did we see Derek Chauvin with his knee on the neck of George Floyd? Repeatedly, over and over and over. To the point where many people, at least that I know, said, I can't take this anymore. So these images reinforce, you talk about white supremacy, it reinforces this idea that you're powerless. You have no power. And that's really what really white supremacy is all about, is power, and trying to say that we have power over those that are not like us. And of course, white supremacy has its roots. Certainly you could go back centuries. And I think what happens now is that we have a state we're at, or a condition we have in this country where there's all this division, and it's kind of like I say, rearing its ugly head. So even more so than ever, people that are of this mindset are empowered to come out, say these things, and whether it be through the media. We know there's media outlets. There's also other platforms, social media platforms, that simply propagate these messages. So they're reinforced over and over and over, but what happens is those who are affected, those communities of color, are experiencing it in a way that has never been before. It is simply something that we're in a whole new world. And so we have to find ways to address these issues, and it's sort of like, where do we begin? I mean, it's such a big thing. So, I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I know we need to have these conversations. And we also, and another thing I talked about before we began, is we need to get to the place where we are able to have these conversations and understand that the systems that are in place are meant to separate us. In other words, you talk about systemic racism and so forth. A lot of these systems are designed to make us feel that we are more different than we are the same. And I think that's part of the problem. So until we're able to do that, we're not going to get anywhere.